Thank you for coming in. I know we are the second to last panel of the day. Thank you for allowing us to somewhat bring it on home with this rather contentious topic of loot boxes and whether or not they constitute gambling. Something that I think I would like everybody in the room to think about as we go through this panel. It originally started as a debate, and Sam's not in here, so I'll just say this was his idea, was to have a setup where we had people assigned to sides. Some people would come in and be assigned the side loot boxes are gambling, and some people would be assigned the side that loot boxes aren't gambling. He and I later had a talk about how it's a little bit more nuanced than this. We have both social and legal definitions of gambling, and I know that Sophie is going to expand significantly on this with regard to these, don't get too scared, as we talked about this earlier, with regard to the legal definitions of gambling, because while there may be sort of one very broad social definition of gambling, this concept that you're risking something of value on an outcome that's uncertain. It's a very broad social definition of gambling under which almost everything fits. I mean, if we talk about social definitions of gambling in this capacity, the most popular item that falls under this definition would be marriage. You're risking something of value on an outcome that may be uncertain. When I walk out the door every morning, it's a little bit of a gamble. I don't know what's going to happen in that day. And so we've created a more refined definition when we look at the law. And that's something that's really going to come into play in this discussion. You're going to see people talk about both the social and legal fits to what we consider to be gambling. So, I'm very pleased to have my panel with me here today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Brett Abarbanel. I'm the Director of Research at the UNLV International Gaming Institute, which is a research institution that researches everything that falls underneath the gambling umbrella. I'm also a faculty member at the UCLA Gambling Studies program, and I'm very pleased to be joined here by my panel members. Would you like me to introduce you, or shall you introduce yourselves?
Happy to introduce ourselves.
Yes, yeah. Excellent. Okay, please.
So my name's John Tilbury. I am not. My background is as a player. I've been sort of playing competitive games for the last 10, 15 years. More recently, was working for a company called Multiplay, who were acquired by Game, and we looked at it. Sort of through that work, a lot of interaction directly with players, and obviously I have a perspective on that myself from my own experience. I'm now working with the governing body for university sport to create a kind of a body to represent esports within universities, develop competitions, develop programs, etc. And again, through that work, a lot of interaction directly with players. I'm not going to have a lot to say on the kind of regulatory framework for esports betting and loot boxes, but I can hopefully offer sort of a player opinion and a more detailed knowledge of kind of the mechanisms within the games for delivering that and sort of how players respond to that.
So my name's Ben Haden. I'm a program director at the Gambling Commission. So I am interested in the regulatory side of life. We regulate gambling in the UK. So in some ways, the whole question of loot boxes and indeed sort of esports more so generally is something that's come into sort of sharper definition for us over the last few years as worlds start to blur somewhat. I've just come from an international regulator conference in Copenhagen, and I promise you it's more exciting than it sounds. But over there, across the world, you talk to all the different sort of regulators with regard to gambling, and they're all interested in loot boxes and what's going on and why and where people have different stances. So it's clearly something that is developing somewhat a life of its own.
Hi, my name is Sophie Goossens. I'm a lawyer at Reed Smith, which is a law firm, a full-service law firm, which is present globally. My team is focusing mainly on entertainment and media industries and anything to do with digital media. And as part of that team, we have been servicing video game publishers and esports companies for a long time. And as such, we came across the issue of the loot boxes and whether or not it would constitute gambling. especially recently, it's been a topic that has been gaining a lot of momentum.
Hi, I'm Ian Smith. I'm the Integrity Commissioner for the Esports Integrity Coalition. My interest in particular is around the impact of gambling on esports on the practice of esports. Primarily that's around match fixing, cash betting, and the impact that has, but obviously I have a peripheral professional and personal interest in loot boxes, both as a gamer and as somebody interested in whether it is gambling and if it can be manipulated in a way that affects the game, the match, the outcome in esports.
Well, excellent. Now that you've introduced yourself, in your individual roles, whether that be as gamer and now running at university level, and that's a very important piece of it, the university level, the age, the maturity and the gameplay that occurs there, as a regulator, as a lawyer, as an integrity commissioner, do you in these roles consider loot boxes to be gambling? We'll start with these sort of flat out statements that obviously I know you've prepared in depth for, just like my undergraduates.
No.
All right.
I think that when the sort of the loot box mechanic within games, when taken in isolation, I don't believe that constitutes gambling. But what I think the risk exists that when that's combined with other elements of the sort of ecosystem, that definition does change. So if we look at something like Counter-Strike, for example, and Valve and the APIs that they employ to allow trading exchange between players, when combined with the loot box mechanic and the fact that sort of creates this ability for people to invest in that ecosystem, I think that's where the line blurs. But taking loot boxes in isolation, I think that they've had a largely positive effect on sort of the games industry and also on gaming as a whole, because they allow, by shifting the cost of, in a lot of cases, you no longer have to buy your game up front, which means games are more accessible to a wider audience and no longer something that you need to dish out £45 for necessarily up front. You can actually choose how to engage. And I think that brings them to a wider audience and also a sort of broader audience in terms of income and kind of social position and all sorts.
So to start with, you'll get, strangely from me, quite a technical answer in terms of can loot boxes be gambling? Well, yes, they can, from our point of view, but there are some factors which need to be taken into consideration. So if you kind of start at the start, there's a situation where someone is effectively paying a stake, so some money, for the opportunity to win a prize, an in-game item, which should be determined or randomly, or at least have the appearance of a sort of predetermined, a sort of random outcome, and that's the loot box. Now, that, to all intents and purposes, can pretty much resemble a gaming machine. But what we're particularly interested in currently is how easy is it to then, or what opportunities are there to access the money? So can you cash out effectively, or can that prize be sort of swapped for money or money's worth? So it's more about when the money leaves the confines of the game, and then it does, to our minds, start to become potentially a sort of licensable activity. But there is the other side of it as well, where you can't sort of escape what public opinion is. So if you are a parent, for example, you're going to sit there and you're probably not going to be that bothered about what a regulator says, technically it's this or technically it's that. You'll be more interested in whether there's any potential harm to your child that could come from this activity. And there the question starts to sort of mushroom and develop in different ways.
So for me as a lawyer, the question is more, is, are loot box gambling as defined by a certain country's legislation? If you look at the definition of what is gambling in the UK, as Ben just outlined for us, you would probably get a different response if you were interrogating right now the equivalent in Belgium, in the Netherlands, or in France. So it really depends, and I know it's a lawyer's response to say it depends, but in this case, it depends what country what legislation are we under first? And then once you find the legislation that you're under, there are other layers to the question, because it will depend on the specific of each situation. So certain games might be very comfortably outside of the zone of gambling, if you consider the English definition of gambling. Mm-hmm. Other games might be more threading on more of a grey area, depending on the characteristics of each loot box.
Also, as a lawyer, I agree with Ben and Sophie, and I think around that definition there's very little doubt. On the social side, though, I do think it constitutes gambling in the sense that you have no idea what the outcome of your effort is. I think the big difference for me is that a lot of the loot box access can be achieved through gameplay, in which case, you know, you're picking up. My old analogy was always, and most of you are too young for this, is the old Panini sticker thing, you know, and you used to buy 5 of those and open them and get a whole bunch of Peter Crouches and get really, really upset that you weren't getting Harry Kane, and then trading your Harry Kanes when you eventually got 2 of them. That analogy extends to loot boxes really easily. So if somebody gave you a set of Panini stickers, happy days, it didn't matter what was in it because you hadn't paid anything for them. And it's the same with your loot boxes that you get through gameplay. The issue I've got is when you pay for these things. Firstly, because I hate the buggers who get advanced in the game by buying the things and getting better people than me and characters and weapons. That drives me mad. But more realistically, the fact is you have no idea what you're getting in the box, and that's a gamble. It's a gamble. You're paying for something you don't know what it is. So that's a punt. But technically, of course, it only becomes an issue for me the minute you can actually then exchange the stuff you bet for money. And we saw the impact of that in the broader sphere with skins in CSGO and Dota, and you know the massive impact that's had. And it's an ongoing impact. For any of you who think that problem's gone away, let me tell you that, you know, as some of you will know, in betting on esports now, just cash betting, not necessarily talking about the old skins betting, but in cash betting, CSGO and Dota account for over 60% of the total market in gambling on all esports. And why is that? And that's because of skins. That's skins. They groomed a generation of gamblers. I'm not saying Valve did it on purpose, but, you know.
You're covering your bases. That's a very lawyer move over there on the end. So I want to touch on something, Ian, that both you and Ben started to get to. Ian, you mentioned the Panini cards. So you know, last week I was in Malta. There's a Panini storefront on Merchant Street there. And I thought this was hilarious. I took a photo and I was showing it to everybody I know, going, ha, 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 check it out. It's a loot box store. I thought it was very funny. Not everybody thought this was very funny. But it does really speak to something of that relationship between the game and the gambling component. Ben, you mentioned, for example, as you start to look into some of these online loot boxes, they start to mimic gambling games. We've seen a lot of people talk about how they mimic slot machines, how the mechanics of the game, the aesthetics of a loot box might look something like a traditional gambling machine. The Parliament of Australia just had a hearing earlier this week regarding loot boxes, and there was testimony said in which they specifically noted that loot boxes are more like gambling machines than they are like baseball cards, or in this case here, the Panini sticker packs. At what point do we then draw the line? Does does the Commission, and it's okay if you say you're not allowed to answer this question, maybe Sophie can answer as a broader EU setup. You know, at what point does the Commission look at these game design mechanics in order to define the gambling? At what point does that become something that comes into play as opposed to this prize chance consideration, sort of traditional definition of gambling?
So I think my perspective on this would be that you can't look at anything in isolation, and that actually within this entire question you need to be considering how things are developing, what the response of publishers are to things that perhaps start to sail a little close to the wind. So how are people reacting, and what research is being done to understand what is going on. So while I haven't looked at it in depth, there's some interesting research that has gone to that particular Australian example around the links between problem gambling and loot boxes. And once that discussion starts, it will gain some traction within the current environment that exists around gambling. So I think I wouldn't look at one specific thing. I would say it starts to be far more about what the overall range of evidence is, and where does that take you.
Okay. One of the things that you've just said actually makes me think of a question here for you, Jonathan. And Ben, what you've said is, you know, what's the response to community reactions? Jonathan, when I asked the question, you know, are loot boxes gambling? And you had told us you were a gamer, your background is in gaming and all of this, and your first response was no. I'll be honest, I was a little surprised. My assessment of my observations of the games community is that this is a horrible, terrible thing. How dare EA and these other manufacturers do such a thing? We want it banned, get rid of it. I want to go back to my traditional model. You also mentioned earlier this idea that it's offered up more opportunities for consumption. You no longer necessarily have to buy your game up front. You can choose how you engage with the game itself. What are your thoughts on these community reactions to, whether it be everything from sort of the indie companies all the way up to the AAA or developers, on these concepts?
I don't think the community has objected necessarily to loot boxes on the principle that they are gambling. I think the response that some gaming communities have to it, and obviously, you know, Battlefront's a great example, is the idea that that mechanic can ultimately give players advantages within the game that others wouldn't. That's the real cause of the controversy. The actual idea that they'd object to the mechanic, I don't think that their view on it is sophisticated enough to see you know, the negative side of that. I think the objection is primarily to the different ways in which that's delivered. If we look at something like the League of Legends community, whilst there have been some changes to the game recently that have caused debate, you know, in fact, they're a bad example because they've only introduced the system relatively recently. Let me think of a better one. So, for example, Counter-Strike. I don't think there's much objection to loot boxes within Counter-Strike because it's purely cosmetic, right? But when you're looking at a game where loot boxes give you the ability to either access in-game advantages that you wouldn't otherwise have, or to bring those forward from the future, to say to skip 1,000 hours of gameplay and have those up front, that's where the objection is. I don't think players generally see an issue with the loot boxes themselves in terms of gambling. I don't think they see that debate most of the time.
Interesting. And Sophie, to go back to one of the concepts that you were discussing in your original spiel, was this idea that when you talk about the legal definition of gambling, it depends. And you said this is the traditional lawyer response, it depends. That warms my academic heart. That's our traditional response as well. What sort of efforts have you seen, or what sort of opportunities, given your experience? I know that you practice law in several jurisdictions, and you have a view as a sort of for a holistic EU perspective. What are your thoughts on harmonization efforts behind this sort of assessment of gambling and gaming, and specifically here, of course, our loot box discussion?
So I think we go back here to the usefulness of definitions again, and the fact that every member state in the European Union having its own definition of gambling is not going to help. And it's definitely not going to help the games publishers when they have to decide on how to deal with this issue of loot boxes. So it's pretty clear that people working in this industry will welcome some clarity, at least having one definition that could apply, if not on a worldwide basis, on a European basis for a start, would be certainly something that the game publishers would welcome. So if you look at gambling at the European Union level, it is an area which is mainly of the competence of member states. So there has been an attempt by the European Commission, especially this Commission at the beginning when they came into their mandate, to work on online gambling and to try to get people together to think about the issue. So there's been a recommendation that has been issued, a recommendation of a framework for conversation. And all of that was on track until more recently, it looks like the Commission has decided to go back a step and to drop the issue and to say that, after all, this topic of online gambling was not a priority anymore at least not a priority in terms of harmonization. And that they believe that the European Court of Justice had given sufficient guidance to every member state so that member states have a toolbox which is robust enough for them to establish how online gambling should be regulated in their country. One thing that I think was interesting when I read the recommendation and when I looked at it is what is exactly the guidance that has been given to every member state in relation to gambling. And the guidance is mainly twofold, is to say that, first of all, online gambling is a service, and service is obviously something that is free to, you have a freedom of service in Europe, so you should be free to service people in other member states. And any restriction to that freedom has to be justified. So restriction to online gambling has to be justified by a member state when they decide to implement restrictions. Then when they decide to implement the restrictions, they also have to explain why they are suitable and necessary. And then on top of that, they also have to demonstrate that whatever objective is being pursued by the restriction is implemented on a consistent basis. And I think that's the most interesting part. It means that you're free as a country, such as Belgium, to define gambling extremely broadly if you want to. At least in my opinion, there's really nothing in EU law that would restrict a country to adopt a very large definition of what gambling is. But what the guidance will say is that you then have to demonstrate that you are going to be consistent in your approach. And to me, it looks like if you want to be consistent with a very wide definition of gambling, then the Panini cards, the Pokemon cards, or even the Kinder Egg could qualify as gambling. So I think the question is, how can you if you're going to be particularly severe with the video games industry, and you're not going to be that severe with the Panini cards or the Pokemon cards in publishers, then maybe you may have an angle at least an angle to try to challenge the definition that has been adopted by the member state.
All right, great. And Ben, based on your experience earlier this week at the very exciting sounding regulators event, we must have raging parties, yes?
All night.
All night. Earlier this week, and my assumption is that it is tied to this event, that your release was tied to this, there's an announcement of a sort of coalition of mostly EU-based regulators and the state of Washington in the United States to approach this convergence of gambling and gaming really hot on the heels of the loot box discussion. Based on what Sophie has described with regard to the ability of all the different member states to set their own definitions of gambling, do you see in this instance that there may be more opportunity for harmonization in that approach?
I think harmonisation is always going to be very difficult because, as Sophie's mentioned, people have different definitions and different approaches. What this exercise was trying to do was to really say, look, we may have slightly different emphases, but we all recognise similar issues, similar questions, similar challenges that exist around things like loot boxes. And actually, we really just want to demonstrate that as a group, we are interested in this, and as a group, we would like to understand it better and engage with those people who are involved better, such that we can have perhaps a better outcome in terms of action being taken a little more swiftly. And that's why I think it was really interesting that we sort of got the US state as well as just the European states who'd originally been talking about it.
Well, somebody had to tag along, right? We couldn't leave you all to your exciting moments and partying all night long. I'm going to sort of turn the discussion a little bit, and then, so this is really more toward you, Ian, and you as well, Jonathan, is how defining loot boxes, or how the existence of loot boxes in general, might have an impact on competitive esports. Everything from sort of the highest echelons of professional sport down into some of the more amateur levels. Because, of course, if we look at certain sports, and golf is the example I frequently like to use as the parallel, golf as a sport has a somewhat similar setup. You have the very highest echelons of the sport, but you continue to have professionals and who make a living playing the game, even as you move down into some of the lower levels. Tennis, perhaps, is a similar setup as well. Do you consider loot boxes, first, whether or not they're defined as gambling, to have an impact on competitive esports? And then if they end up being defined as gambling, does that change that impact?
I'll answer the second part first. From my perspective, is no. It doesn't really make a difference. I think the impact is indirect, and it's kind of obvious in one clear example is, say, for example, the prize money at the international. Is driven. It's out of all proportion with any other prize money pool, tournament, league in esports completely by millions and millions and millions of dollars. And that's driven by the purchase of skins. And I think that's a great idea. I've got no criticism of that, but it has a direct impact on esports because it makes Dota look like it's actually important.
That woke up the whole room.
Yeah. So, no, but you can see how it has an indirect impact when on this. And so there's that side of things. But the fact is, of course, that on the Valve side, at least, with Dota and CSGO, there's no impact on gameplay by their loot box offering and skins. And so, in that sense, I think it's extremely valuable to the esports ecosystem, from the international to team engagement, to the skins that relate to individual players, to teams, to brands. And it creates a really good interaction and more or less, other than the personal interest of the developers themselves, drives the interaction between Valve and esports using Valve titles, because they have no other interest in it, apparently. However, we are conscious that there are other games where what you're effectively buying or winning in the loot boxes actually does have an impact on gameplay and your ability to participate. And I think FUT is a great example of this with EA's way of dealing with it. From an esports perspective, I think it's garbage, but from a money-making perspective, it's amazing. The fact that everyone ends up playing with exactly the same teams in FIFA, once you hit the pinnacle of that and you've spent thousands of dollars buying rubbish players in order to get the good ones, you end up playing against a guy, and in a strange way, it actually means it's skill versus skill instead of team versus team. But so yeah, there's an impact, but it's indirect. And I think if you look at the top end of esport as a broad proposition across your tier 1 titles, CSGO, Dota, League of Legends, and to some extent Overwatch, it has no impact at the level that I'm interested in and that most people are interested in. As you go down into the tiers, I think that there's opportunities there to help monetize the lower ends of the esport spectrum better, but it's part of a it's a small part of a much bigger picture.
Mm-hmm. And then, Jonathan, how about you? Because at the collegiate level, I mean, you certainly still have some of the skill that you might see at these professional levels, but it's a very different setup. Do you find that loot boxes have an impact on collegiate play?
I would go going back slightly.
Oh, yeah.
Going to a slightly higher level. I actually think that loot boxes are a fundamental part of the esports landscape. I think they're largely one of the reasons why we're here today. Loot boxes and the in-game microtransactions transformed the way that publishers approach games. Right? It was all about cash grab, how many sales can we drive up front, initial marketing push, and then nothing. They might have had an expansion plan or something along those lines. But microtransactions have enabled publishers to monetize the longevity of the game, which then encourages them to make an ongoing commitment to that community. And one of the ways that they make that ongoing commitment is through esports, is through the sport of competitions. While Riot will never say that they're really effectively monetizing the LCS. Of course they are. It's what's driving the engagement with their game, or driving a large amount of the engagement with their game. You look at something like Counter-Strike. Valve support of Counter-Strike during sort of 10 years ago was fairly non-existent. It's not dramatic now, but it's changed because they have the ability to monetize the game on an ongoing basis. They still charge the upfront fee, but they've got that monetization on an ongoing basis. And I think, if loot boxes, granted there are other ways, that there are other ways of monetizing the game through microtransactions other than loot boxes. Loot boxes have been an effective tool to do that, and I think they one of the things that ultimately drives esports. If you took them away, it wouldn't collapse. The International is a great example, but actually the way that they monetize and the way that they generate that sort of crowd-funded prize pool, it's partially dependent on loot boxes, but there are other elements of value there. If you took away the loot boxes, there would still be a product there that people were buying, and the prize pool would still be 10 million plus, even without that element of random chance. Specifically within universities and sort of collegiate esports, again, having the publishers seeing the value of longevity in their game encourages them to invest and engage with grassroots competitions in collegiate and university and schools. They're all sort of part of that. So I think the two things are sort of meshed together. And I'm not saying that it doesn't work without it, but I think that there is a sort of strong relationship between
Yeah,
two.
it is a really good point. It passed a critical mass because of loot box and skins, and that's right.
All right, lovely. Well, we're coming up on the end here. I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. I have more, but I will just do that as a last resort, I think. And the app. Wow, it's quite a few. Okay, let's see here. I'm picking the best one. Oh, we got a fifth in here. Oh, I'm going with the last one. From Anonymous. Oh. No, that was one. Nikolai is not anonymous. As a parent, would you be happy for your child to play a game with loot boxes and/or buy them?
Yes, but with some control in place.
One or two.
I think there are definitely improvements that can be made to the system to make systems that are currently being used to make them safer. You look at China, just publishing stating what the actual odds are on that. It's still, to me, although I support the loot box model, it's still nonsense to me that you actually have no idea what your chance of getting that item are. You could have somebody that sat there hitting the button over and over again because they believe that there's a 1 in 10 chance of getting something, and actually it's a 1 in a million chance. It's for me, I find that nonsense. And there are other controls on spending which publishers self-regulate. Those controls are largely in place, and PEGI have just announced a kind of a new I don't know what they call it, a category that they place against games to clear to parents that those microtransactions exist. I don't think that any child should be given unrestricted access to the ability to buy loot boxes. That would be nonsense. But I don't see anything wrong with the model when it's used sort of responsibly.
And it's interesting you bring up the point regarding what you might get in the loot box, because I can't think of a single gambling jurisdiction where there is legal gambling, where they don't require a gambling machine to provide the pay table of that game. Or anybody else want to address the parent question? Maybe some of the parents?
Yeah, well, for me it always depends, firstly, which game and whether I approve of it or not. And if they're playing on my account and it's smurfing, that's awesome. But yeah, control is really what it's all about, is making sure that it's responsible. I've got no inherent objection to it at all. I mean, I buy loot boxes, or I desperately try and get them in gameplay myself all the time, and I love it. I mean, I love opening them, especially ones I haven't paid for. But it's got to be controlled, and it depends on the age of the kid. And mine are only 32, so I'm still that's rubbish. They're much younger than that, because it's a relatively new phenomenon, I've only had to deal with them in their teenage years. I think I would have taken a very different attitude when they were younger.
It's like anything else they do. You worry about them constantly, whether they're playing rugby or whether they're playing on the Xbox. So it's about information. And while you don't want to sit your child down and go, X, Y, Z, A, B, C, it's going to be a very dull relationship. You do want to guide them in a careful way, and actually, sometimes when you're not there, you would like information to be there that's easy for them to understand as to what they're about to do, potentially, and I don't think that is always there. So that's what makes me nervous.
Do you want to feel that? I'm happy to go to the next one if you just want. Oh, okay.
Everything has been said, I think.
Okay. So this touches on this next question touches on a point that we didn't really get into that much with this panel. Overwatch is a game where loot boxes can be earned and also purchased. However, the cosmetics that you can get solely belong to you. What are your thoughts on the legality or illegality of that concept?
I mean, I think maybe I can offer just one thought, is that when you look at whether the cosmetic one might fall under the scope of the definition, I think the response lies in whether or not there is some value in those cosmetics. I think, to go back to your point, when at the beginning of the panel, to define what is gambling, is if there is value, and then what is the threshold of that value? Can you transfer the value? Can you cash out on that value or not? If you cannot, and if it's pretty innocent cosmetic, I think we go back to the Panini cards, to be honest. But that would be a view. I think whether or not there is value, and whether the value is an element that is important to define whether or not you're in the territory of gambling, that's again down to the regulators and legislators.
Well, we're, for the most part, out of time. Is there any sort of last word that anybody would like to say on the matter before we just let everybody walk up here and ask questions themselves?
Can I tell you what I noticed around the Battlefront thing, and I think everybody could relate to this, when it first really became prominent, is the ultimate arbiter in the esports and the gaming community is the player. You know, everything around balance, community, engagement with the game, non-engagement with the game is community driven. And the loot box success or otherwise of it as initiatives in all its different forms will be determined by the players. And I've learned to trust them. You know, that old lawyer's instinct of controlling everything myself and writing the rules and enforcing the rules and being the judge and being God, as I usually am, have slowly been eroded by my trust in the community on these issues. As I've, particularly around issues or, you know, game balance, hero balance, rebalances, map changes, and these things used to completely freak me out, because I come from a traditional sports background where that was just anathema. But to be honest, if you get something wrong in this area, the community will tell you in 10 seconds flat, and I'm pretty comfortable with that.
Right, wonderful. Well, thank you so much to our panel. Thank you to ESI for welcoming us here. If you have any questions, please come up and ask everyone. Otherwise, I think we'll get off the stage for the next event.